May 31st. Itenjobai Sydney Harbour. The night air hung thick over the water, carrying with it the scent of salt and diesel fuel. Across the darkened harbour, the lights of Australia's greatest city flickered like distant stars, reflecting off the gentle waves that lapped against the hulls of warships anchored in the bay. To the thousands of civilians sleeping in their beds that night, Sydney felt safe, protected, thousands of miles from the front lines of a war that seemed to belong to someone else. But beneath those dark waters, something was moving. At exactly 8 p.m., the first one entered, silent, methodical, a steel predator slipping through the incomplete anti-submarine nets like a ghost passing through walls. Then came the second, and the third, 3 Japanese Midget submarines, each carrying 2 men and enough firepower to change the course of Australia's war. By morning, 2 of those submarines would be destroyed, their crews dead, their twisted metal hulks pulled from the harbor floor. The world would see their remains, touch them, photograph them. Their story would be told, retold, and recorded in the annals of military history. But the third submarine, the third one, vanished. For 64 years, it existed only in whispers and speculation. More than 50 people would claim to have found it. Treasure hunters, sonar operators, weekend divers with wild theories and confident assertions. Every single one of them was wrong. The submarine had simply disappeared, as if it had sailed through a crack in reality itself and emerged somewhere beyond the reach of human understanding. Its 2-man crew, Sub-Lieutenant Katsuhisa and Petty Officer Mamoru Ashibe, became phantoms. Their faces stared out from wartime photographs, forever young, forever enigmatic. Their final moments, known only to the dark waters that swallowed them whole. Where did they go? How did they die? Did they fight to survive until their batteries ran dry and their steel tombs slowly filled with seawater, or did they choose death on their own terms, following the warrior's code to its ultimate conclusion? And perhaps most mysteriously of all, why was their submarine eventually discovered heading north, away from Sydney, in the exact opposite direction of their planned rendezvous point? Were they lost, running, or executing some final, desperate plan that no one would ever understand? This is the story of M-24, the ghost submarine, the one that got away and the one that never came home. A tale of courage, mystery, and the terrible secrets that lie 55 meters beneath the waves, waiting in the darkness for someone to finally tell the truth. But to understand how M-24 vanished, we must first understand how it arrived. We must go back to that spring evening in 1942, when the war finally came to Sydney Harbour, and 3 submarines brought death to Australia's doorstep. The spring of 1942 marked a turning point in the Pacific War, though few realized it at the time. In the 5 months since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Imperial Navy had carved through the Pacific like a sword through silk. Hong Kong had fallen. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable fortress, had surrendered. The Philippines were lost. The Dutch East Indies had collapsed. Across Southeast Asia, the rising sun flag flew over territories that had taken European powers centuries to conquer. Japan stood at the zenith of its power, but the architects of that expansion understood a brutal truth. They had awakened a sleeping giant, and now they faced the full industrial might of the United States, preparing to strike back. In May 1942, the war approached its decisive moment. Massive fleets positioned themselves across the Pacific, preparing for clashes that would determine the fate of nations. For Australia, the war had arrived with shocking brutality on February 19, when Japanese bombers appeared over Darwin. More than 240 people died in that single day. Then came the attacks on Queensland, Western Australia, and the Torres Strait Islands. Each raid drove home the same terrifying message: the Japanese were coming, and nowhere was truly safe. Yet Sydney, Australia's crown jewel, remained untouched. Its harbor bustled with warships from half a dozen nations. The USS Chicago, a heavy cruiser bristling with guns, sat at anchor alongside HMAS Canberra and vessels from Britain and the Netherlands. To most Sydneysiders, their city felt protected by distance and naval power. When one resident was asked about the possibility of attack, she replied with characteristic Australian defiance: "If London can take it, Surrey Hills can take it." But the Japanese Navy had other plans. In early May, the 8th Submarine Squadron's Eastern Attack Group received their orders. 6 massive I-class submarines, each capable of carrying 1,000 tons of fuel and armed with smaller attack craft, were to strike at Sydney Harbour. Their mission was not conquest, but distraction. Japanese strategists hoped that sinking major warships inside Sydney would force the Americans to divert strength from the Central Pacific, where the crucial battles would be fought. The plan was audacious. Reconnaissance flights had already been conducted by float planes launched from submarines, circling Sydney Harbour at dawn, photographing the positions of Allied warships. The pilots returned with intelligence that made the attack seem worthwhile. The harbor was full of targets, and its defenses appeared incomplete. By May 17th, disaster struck before the operation even began. The submarine I-28, carrying one of the Midget submarines, was torpedoed by the USS Tautog and sent to the bottom of the Pacific. The attack force was reduced to 5 mother submarines and 3 Midget craft. On May 29th, the remaining submarines rendezvoused 35 nautical miles northeast of Sydney Harbour. In the pre-dawn darkness, a reconnaissance plane took off from I-21, piloted by Flying Officer Susumu Ito. The aircraft circled twice over the harbour, its navigation lights burning, so brazen that Allied personnel initially mistook it for one of their own. When fighters were finally scrambled to intercept, the plane was already gone, its crew having confirmed the presence of their primary target, the USS Chicago. Late in the afternoon of May 31st, 3 submarines, I-22, I-24, and I-27, moved into position 7 miles from the harbor entrance. They formed an arc across the approaches, diesel engines rumbling as they prepared for the final phase. As the sun set over Sydney, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, 3 hatches opened on the mother submarine's decks. One by one, the Midget submarines were released. Each Type A Kohyoteki-class vessel measured 79 feet long and displaced 46 tons when submerged. They carried 2 18-inch torpedoes in their bow tubes and could operate underwater for approximately 12 hours on battery power. Inside each cramped hull, 2 men sat at their controls, breathing recycled air and listening to the whisper of electric motors. These were not suicide weapons in the traditional sense. They were built to exacting standards, engineered with the expectation that crews might return. But every man who climbed into those steel cylinders understood the reality. This mission pushed the boundaries of what was survivable. And if survival proved impossible, they had been trained to choose death over capture, to destroy their vessels and themselves rather than provide intelligence to the enemy. The crews had been selected from the elite Midget submarine training program. They were young, skilled, and utterly committed to their mission. Lieutenant Kenshi Chuman and Petty Officer Takeshi Omori in M-27. Lieutenant Keiyu Matsuo and Petty Officer Masao Suzuku in M-22. And in M-24, 23-year-old Sub-Lieutenant Katsuhisa Ban and 24-year-old Petty Officer Mamoru Ashibe, who had only been added to the mission 2 weeks earlier, when an accident on their mother submarine had created an unexpected opening. As darkness fell completely over Sydney Harbour, the three submarines began their approach. Their electric motors hummed quietly as they descended to periscope depth. Through their narrow viewing ports, the crews could see the lights of Sydney reflecting off the water. And beyond those lights, the silhouettes of warships against the night sky. Inside the harbor, life continued normally. Ferries chugged between Circular Quay and Manly. Sailors relaxed on deck or slept in their bunks. The anti-submarine boom net at the harbor entrance remained incomplete, a gap in the defenses that would prove fatal. At exactly 8 p.m., the first Midget submarine crossed the indicator loop at the harbor entrance. The detection equipment registered a signal, but in the confusion of evening ferry traffic, no one recognized it for what it truly was, an act of war. Sliding silently through Sydney's front door, M-27 was the first to die. Lieutenant Kenshi Chuman guided his submarine through the harbor entrance at 8 p.m., the electric motor purring softly as the vessel descended into the dark water. But the Sydney Harbour defenses, incomplete as they were, still had teeth. Within minutes, M-27's propellers became hopelessly entangled in the anti-submarine nets stretched across the western boom gate. The submarine lurched, then stopped. Inside the cramped hull, Chuman and his navigator, Petty Officer Takeshi Omori, felt the vessel tilt at an unnatural angle. They tried reversing the motors. Nothing. The propellers screamed against the steel cables, but the nets held firm. They were trapped, suspended in the water like a fly in a spider's web. On the surface, a Maritime Services Board watchman named Jimmy Cargill rowed his small boat near the boom gate, checking the nets as he did every evening. Something caught his eye, a disturbance in the water. Unusual patterns of foam and wake where there should be none. He stared at it for a long moment, then turned his boat toward the nearest patrol vessel. By 9:30 p.m., patrol boats HMAS Euroma and HMAS Lolita had arrived to investigate. Their searchlights cut through the darkness, illuminating something large and metallic caught in the netting. For 90 minutes, confusion reigned. Was it debris? A sunken boat? The crews debated, radioed for instructions, and approached cautiously. Inside M-27, Chuman and Omori knew their mission had ended before it truly began. They could hear the patrol boats above them, the rumble of their engines growing closer. There would be no escape, no second chance. The decision they faced was the one every Midget submarine crew had been trained for: capture or death. For warriors of the Imperial Navy, there was only one acceptable choice. At exactly 10:37 p.m., a massive explosion erupted from beneath the water. The blast sent a column of flame and water 50 feet into the air. The shockwave rolled across the harbor, rattling windows in nearby homes and sending seabirds screaming into the night sky. When the water settled, nothing remained of M-27, except fragments of twisted metal slowly sinking to the harbor floor. Chuman and Omori had activated their scuttling charges, choosing to destroy themselves and their vessel rather than face capture. The explosion triggered the general alarm. At 10:27 p.m., Rear Admiral Gerard Muirhead Gould, the naval officer in command of Sydney's defenses, issued a vague warning order. Across the harbor, ship crews scrambled to battle stations. Searchlights began sweeping the water. Depth charges were readied on patrol boats. But in the confusion and darkness, with ferry traffic still running and civilian vessels moving across the harbor, identifying friend from foe proved nearly impossible. M-27's dramatic end had announced to all of Sydney that enemy submarines were in their harbor. But what the defenders didn't yet know was that 2 more submarines were already deep inside, hunting for targets. M-22 had entered the harbor at 9:48 p.m. 20 minutes before M-27's destruction. Lieutenant Keiyu Matsuo carefully navigated his vessel through the Eastern Channel, moving slowly to conserve battery power. For hours, his submarine prowled the harbor unmolested. The crew listening to the chaos above as patrol boats raced back and forth, dropping depth charges in random patterns, hoping to strike something, anything, in the darkness below. But M-22's luck ran out shortly after 1 a.m. as the submarine re-entered the harbor after recovering from an earlier depth charge attack. It was spotted near Taylor's Bay by HMAS Yandra. The patrol boat's crew saw the distinctive wake of a periscope cutting through the water, a thin white line against the black surface. The hunt was on. 3 patrol boats, Sea Mist, Steady Hour, and Yoroma, converged on Taylor's Bay. For the next 3 hours, they subjected the area to a relentless barrage of depth charges. The explosions rolled through the water like underwater thunder, each blast sending pressure waves that could crack a submarine's hull like an eggshell. Fish floated dead to the surface by the hundreds. The water churned white with each detonation. Lieutenant Reg Andrew, commanding Sea Mist, spotted movement in the water after one particularly close explosion. Through the darkness, he saw the submarine surface, briefly, its hull inverted, rolling in the waves. He ordered another depth charge, dropped directly on the target. The explosion was decisive. When divers finally examined M-22 days later, they found something both fascinating and horrifying. The submarine's engines were still running, the contra-rotating propellers turning slowly, powered by batteries that refused to die. But inside the hull, Matsuo and Suzuku were dead, killed by their own hands. Rather than wait for the hull to rupture and flood, rather than endure the crushing death that depth charges bring, they had taken out their service pistols and ended it themselves. The water inside the submarine was stained with their blood. But while M-27 died at the harbor entrance and M-22 fought its losing battle in Taylor's Bay, the 3rd submarine moved through Sydney Harbour like a phantom. M-24 had followed a Manly ferry through the eastern gate at 9:48 p.m., slipping through the boom defenses in the ferry's wake. For over an hour, Sub-Lieutenant Katsuhisa navigated his vessel deep into the harbor. Undetected and unmolested, he could hear the explosions in the distance, the death throes of his comrades. But his mission remained unchanged: find the USS Chicago and send it to the bottom. At 10:52 p.m., M-24's conning tower broke the surface near Garden Island, just 500 yards from its target. Through his periscope, Ban could see the massive silhouette of the USS Chicago, the American heavy cruiser that represented the entire reason for this attack. The ship was illuminated by floodlights from the construction of Garden Island's dry dock, making it stand out against the darkness, like a stage performer under spotlights. Ban must have felt a surge of triumph. After hours of creeping through hostile waters, after watching his fellow crews die, he had reached his target. The mission could still succeed. One good shot could change everything. But lookouts aboard the Chicago spotted M-24's conning tower. Searchlights swiveled, pinning the submarine in their beam. The cruiser's 5-inch guns roared to life. But in their haste to fire, the gun crews discovered a terrible problem. They couldn't depress the barrels low enough to hit a target so close to the hull. Shells screamed over the submarine, exploding harmlessly in the water beyond. Ban crash-dived, taking M-24 deep beneath the surface. For the next 90 minutes, he played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the patrol boats. The submarine moved erratically through the harbor, surfacing briefly, diving again, trying to shake its pursuers while maneuvering into position for an attack. The question that would haunt historians for decades was this: why did it take Ban 90 minutes to travel less than a mile to reach his firing position? The submarine had covered far greater distances in far less time earlier in the evening. Was M-24 damaged? Was Ban disoriented? Or was he deliberately drawing out the hunt, buying time for his fellow submarines, or simply accepting that his death was inevitable and choosing to make it count? At approximately 12:30 a.m. on June 1st, from a position off Bradley's head, Ban finally fired. The first torpedo launched with a hiss of compressed air, its propeller spinning up as it raced toward the Chicago. Seconds later, the second torpedo followed. Both weapons were armed and running hot. Ban had used a 60-degree deflection setting on his torpedoes, a difficult shot from an awkward angle. Perhaps he had no choice. Perhaps it was the best he could manage, given the patrol boats hunting him. Whatever the reason, both torpedoes missed their intended target. The first torpedo ran straight, passing harmlessly past the Chicago's stern and grounding itself on Garden Island. It failed to explode, wedging itself into the rocky shore where it would later be defused by bomb disposal experts who approached it with trembling hands. But the second torpedo found a target, just not the one Ban had aimed for. The weapon passed directly beneath the Dutch submarine Katsuhisa, which was moored at Garden Island. The crew of the Dutch vessel felt the torpedo brush past their hull, close enough that they could hear its propeller churning through the water. It continued on, tracking toward the seawall, and there, moored against that wall, was HMAS Kutubul. The Kutubul had once been one of Sydney's largest ferries, a grand vessel that carried passengers across the harbour in peacetime. When war came, the Royal Australian Navy requisitioned it, converting the ferry into a floating barracks for sailors awaiting transfer to their ships. On the night of May 31st, over 200 men were aboard, most of them sleeping in hammocks below deck after a long day of work. The torpedo struck the seawall directly beneath the Kutubul at 12:30 a.m. The explosion was catastrophic. Witnesses on shore reported seeing the entire ferry lift out of the water, as if a giant hand had picked it up and shaken it. The blast tore through the hull, ripping apart steel and wood like tissue paper. The stern section sank immediately, dragging men down into the cold, dark water before they could even understand what had happened. The rest of the vessel took an hour to sink, its bow section and funnel remaining above water as men scrambled to escape. Inside the wreckage, sailors were trapped in twisted metal and shattered bulkheads. Some were thrown clear by the blast, launched through windows and doors like rag dolls. Others were pinned beneath debris, screaming for help that couldn't reach them in time. Bandsman M.N. Cummings had boarded the Kutubul only 5 minutes before the explosion. He survived with minor cuts, but instead of swimming to safety, he stripped off his uniform and dove repeatedly into the freezing, debris-filled water. 3 times he went down into the wreckage, searching blindly in the darkness for survivors. 3 men owed their lives to his courage: Captain A. B. Doyle and Commander C. Clark also dove into the shattered vessel, their hands cut and bleeding from the jagged metal and broken glass. They worked frantically to pull men from the wreckage, but nervous personnel on the wharf kept ordering them to turn off their torches, fearing the lights would draw more attacks. So they worked in darkness, feeling their way through the wreckage, trying to distinguish the living from the dead by touch alone. When dawn finally broke over Sydney Harbour, the full extent of the tragedy became clear. 21 men had died aboard the Kutubul, 19 Australians and 2 British sailors. Among the dead were men who had already survived other sinkings. Men who had thought they had found safety in Sydney Harbour. David Trist had survived the sinking of HMS Repulse off the Malayan coast, only to die 6 months later in what should have been a safe harbor. Frank Kirby had escaped the bombing of HMS Cornwall in the Indian Ocean, only to meet his end within sight of Sydney's shore. Most of the dead were stokers, engine room ratings who had been billeted closest to the point of explosion. Only 2 men from the stokers' mess survived. The blast had been so powerful that it had simply erased them, leaving behind only fragments and memories. As rescue operations continued through the early morning hours, patrol boats scoured the harbor for the submarine that had fired the fatal torpedo. But M-24's had vanished at 1:58 a.m. The indicator loop at the harbor entrance registered an outbound crossing. Analysis would later show that this was M-24, successfully escaping Sydney Harbour after completing its attack. The submarine had entered the harbor at 9:48 p.m. It had fired its torpedoes at 12:30 a.m. It had departed at approximately 1:58 a.m. From infiltration to escape, the entire operation had taken just over 4 hours. M-24 had survived where its sister vessels had been destroyed. It had struck a blow against the Allies, even if it hadn't sunk the intended target. And now it was heading back to the open ocean, back to the rendezvous point where the mother submarines waited. But M-24 would never reach that rendezvous. The submarine and its 2-man crew were heading toward a fate that would remain a mystery for 64 years. A secret kept by the dark waters off Sydney's northern coast. The mother submarines waited off Port Hacking, 20 nautical miles south of Sydney Harbour. For 3 days, they maintained their positions in a carefully arranged pattern, scanning the horizon through their periscopes, listening on their radio frequencies for any sign of the Midget submarines. The crews of I-22, I-24, and I-27 knew the attack had taken place. They had heard the distant rumble of explosions carrying across the water. But as the hours stretched into days, hope faded into grim certainty. By June TRAS, the mother submarines could wait no longer. Allied patrol aircraft were intensifying their searches, and remaining in the area meant risking the entire operation. The submarines submerged and turned away from the Australian coast, leaving behind their smaller craft and the 6 men who had crewed them. None of the Midget submarines would return. None of the 6 submariners would ever see Japan again. Within days, M-27 and M-22 were raised from Sydney Harbour. Their twisted hulls were examined, measured, and photographed. The bodies of the 4 crewmen were recovered and treated with unexpected dignity. On June 12, they were cremated at Sydney's Eastern Suburbs Crematorium with full military honors. Rear Admiral Muirhead Gould himself attended the service, along with the Swiss Consul General and members of the press. The decision to honor enemy dead with a military funeral sparked controversy. Many Australians were outraged that the men who had killed 21 sailors should receive such respect. But Muirhead Gould stood firm in his decision. These men had shown courage, he argued, regardless of which flag they served. And perhaps, he hoped, this gesture of respect might encourage the Japanese to treat Australian prisoners of war with similar humanity. It was a hope that would ultimately prove futile. But in that moment, it represented an attempt to maintain some standard of civilized conduct in an increasingly brutal war. The ashes of Lieutenant Chumon, Petty Officer Omori, Lieutenant Matsuo, and Petty Officer Suzuku were eventually returned to Japan through a diplomatic exchange in August 1942. When the ship Kamakura Maru arrived at Yokohama with the 4 white boxes containing the submariners' ashes, several thousand people crowded the pier to honor them. They had been elevated to hero status, posthumously promoted 2 ranks, and granted citations by Emperor Hirohito himself. Their sacrifice had become propaganda. Their deaths transformed into symbols of warrior spirit and national glory. But what of M-24? What of Sub-Lieutenant Ban and Petty Officer Ashibe? The submarine had been detected, leaving Sydney Harbour at 1:58 a.m. on June 1st. The indicator loop recorded an outbound crossing, confirming that at least one submarine had successfully escaped. But from that moment forward, M-24 simply vanished. It never appeared at the rendezvous point. It never made contact with the mother submarines. It was as if the vessel had sailed off the edge of the world. In the days following the attack, Australian naval forces conducted extensive searches of the waters around Sydney. Nothing was found. Theories began to emerge almost immediately, each attempting to explain the inexplicable disappearance. The first theory held that M-24 had been damaged during the battle in Taylor's Bay. Several patrol boat crews reported seeing or hearing multiple submarines in that area, leading some to believe that M-24 might have been caught in the same depth charge attack that destroyed M-22. Perhaps both submarines had sunk in the same location. Their wrecks intermingled on the harbor floor. But when M-22 was raised, there was no sign of a second submarine nearby. The second theory suggested that M-24 had attempted to reach the rendezvous point but exhausted its batteries before arrival. The submarine had operated for over 4 hours inside Sydney Harbour, far longer than the other 2 craft. It had maneuvered extensively, running at various speeds and depths, all of which drained the battery reserves. If M-24 had run out of power somewhere between Sydney and Port Hacking, it would have slowly sunk to the ocean floor, entombing its crew in a steel coffin that would lie undisturbed in the deep water. A third theory proposed something more deliberate. Perhaps Ban and Ashibe had decided not to return to the rendezvous point at all, if they believed they were being pursued, or if they feared leading Allied forces to the mother submarines. They might have chosen to head in a different direction entirely, either running straight out to sea or turning north along the coast. This would explain why M-24 was never found near the expected location. But it raised another question. Why would they do that? What possible advantage could be gained by abandoning the planned escape route? For 64 years, these theories remained nothing more than speculation. M-24 existed only in official reports and fading memories. More than 50 people approached the Royal Australian Navy over the decades, claiming to have found the missing submarine. Some pointed to sonar anomalies. Others insisted they had seen wreckage in various locations up and down the coast. In 1997, there was significant excitement when a metallic object was detected off Cronulla, south of Sydney. Surely this had to be M-24. But investigation proved it was nothing more than debris. Another false lead in an endless series of disappointments. In 2005, a documentary titled M-24, The Last Sunrise, claimed that side-scan radar had located the submarine near Lion Island at the mouth of the Hawkesbury River, north of Sydney. The filmmakers were confident. The evidence seemed compelling. But once again, closer examination revealed that they were wrong. The submarine remained lost. By 2006, M-24 had achieved an almost mythical status in Australian naval history. It had become the submarine that couldn't be found, the mystery that refused to be solved. Veterans who had been present during the attack were aging and passing away, taking their memories with them. The window for solving the mystery seemed to be closing forever. Then, on a routine weekend diving trip, 7 amateur divers made a discovery that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about M-24's final moments. The men who called themselves the no-frills divers were experienced recreational divers who regularly explored the waters off Sydney's northern beaches. On November 12th, Liang Qianling Liu, They were diving near Newport Beach when their echo sounder registered an unusual anomaly on the seafloor. It was large, cylindrical, resting in 55 meters of water on a sandy bottom about 3 miles offshore from Bungan Head. They descended to investigate, their lights cutting through the murky water as they dropped deeper and deeper. And there, sitting upright on the ocean floor, was a submarine. Its hull was covered in marine growth and fishing nets. But the distinctive shape was unmistakable. The contra-rotating propellers, the conning tower with its observation ports, the general dimensions and configuration. They had found M-24, but they had found it in completely the wrong place. The submarine was north of Sydney, not south. It was nowhere near the planned rendezvous point off Port Hacking. Instead, it lay in the opposite direction, miles away from where 64 years of search efforts had focused. How had it gotten here? Why had Ban and Ashibe turned north instead of south? As the divers examined the wreck more closely, they noticed something that sent chills down their spines, despite their insulated dive suits. The conning tower hatch appeared to have been torn open, possibly by fishing nets that had snagged on the submarine over the decades. And through that opening, they could see into the dark interior of the vessel. The hull was filled with sand up to just below the conning tower. Marine growth covered every surface. Acid from the batteries had corroded through the stern section, leaving gaping holes in the metal. But most significantly, most hauntingly, the entry ladder was still in the raised position. That single detail told a story more clearly than any official report could. The ladder being raised meant that no one had ever climbed out of the submarine. Ban and Ashibe were still inside, had been inside for 64 years, sealed in their steel tomb beneath the waves. The divers surfaced and immediately contacted the authorities. Within days, Navy divers had confirmed the identification. This was indeed M-24, the ghost submarine, the one that had vanished into maritime legend. The wreck was declared a provisional historical shipwreck on November 27th, and a 500-meter exclusion zone was established around it, with penalties of up to $1.1 million for violations. But the discovery of M-24 answered one question while raising a dozen others. Now we knew where the submarine had ended up, but we still didn't know how it had gotten there, or what had happened to Ban and Ashibe in their final moments. The wreck itself offered tantalizing clues, but no definitive answers. There were no signs of explosion or catastrophic damage that would indicate a depth charge attack or scuttling charges being used. The hull was intact, save for the corrosion damage. Whatever had killed M-24 had done so quietly, leaving the submarine to sink slowly to the bottom, taking its secrets with it into the darkness. The wreck of M-24 lies in the darkness, 55 meters below the surface, and with it lies one of the most enduring mysteries of the Pacific War. For all that we now know about where the submarine ended up, we still face the fundamental question: what happened to Ban and Ashibe in those final hours after they escaped Sydney Harbour? The discovery in 2006 provided physical evidence that could finally be analyzed, examined, and interpreted. Maritime archaeologists, naval historians, and dive teams have studied every accessible detail of the wreck. And from their investigations, several theories have emerged. Some are grounded in mechanical reality and the brutal physics of submarine warfare. Others venture into the psychological territory of what drives men to make certain choices when death becomes inevitable. The most widely accepted theory centers on battery exhaustion and navigational error. M-24 operated inside Sydney Harbour for over 4 hours, far longer than its sister submarines, and far longer than the typical endurance parameters for these vessels. The Type A Midget submarines carried 200 batteries in their stern compartment, providing enough power for approximately 12 hours of operation under ideal conditions. But ideal conditions rarely exist in combat. Ban had run the submarine at various speeds and depths throughout the night. He had crash-dived to avoid gunfire from the USS Chicago. He had maneuvered extensively while being hunted by patrol boats. He had accelerated to firing position and then fled at high speed after launching his torpedoes. Each of these actions drew heavily on battery reserves. By the time M-24 cleared Sydney Harbour at approximately 2 a.m., those batteries would have been significantly depleted. But this raises the crucial question: why did Ban turn north instead of south? The rendezvous point was 20 miles south, off port hacking. Every minute spent heading in the wrong direction was a minute that drained precious battery power and reduced the chances of survival. If Ban knew where he was supposed to go, why didn't he go there? One possibility is that he simply didn't know. After hours of running, submerged in the dark, under constant stress, with explosions echoing through the water and patrol boats hunting overhead, Ban may have become disoriented. The submarine's compass could have been affected by the magnetic anomalies common in Sydney's harbor area, or damaged by the depth charges that had detonated nearby. In the darkness and confusion, Ban might have genuinely believed he was heading south toward safety when he was actually heading north toward open ocean. Another factor to consider is the condition of the submarine itself after hours of operation. The wreck shows significant corrosion damage in the battery compartment, with large holes eaten through the hull by acid. While much of this damage occurred over decades of lying on the ocean floor, it's possible that the batteries began failing or leaking even during the mission. Lead-acid batteries of that era were notoriously unstable, especially when subjected to the kind of stress that depth charges create. If the batteries were damaged and leaking, they would have provided less power than expected, while simultaneously filling the submarine's interior with toxic fumes. This leads to the second major theory: toxic gas poisoning. Hydrogen sulfide and other gases produced by failing batteries are invisible, odorless in small concentrations, and deadly. In the confined space of a Midget submarine, where air circulation was minimal and the crew had already been breathing recycled air for hours, even a small leak from the battery compartment could have had catastrophic effects. Ban and Ashibe would have experienced symptoms gradually: headaches, dizziness, confusion, difficulty breathing. As the concentration increased, their judgment would have deteriorated. They might have made navigational errors without realizing it. They might have failed to notice warning signs that the submarine was in trouble. Eventually, as the gas continued to accumulate, they would have lost consciousness. The submarine would have continued on whatever heading they had set, running on autopilot until the batteries finally died and the vessel sank slowly to the bottom. This theory explains several key pieces of evidence. It explains why the entry ladder remained in the raised position. The crew never had a chance to evacuate because they were already unconscious or dead when the submarine sank. It explains why there are no signs of scuttling charges being used. Ban and Ashibe never made the conscious decision to destroy their vessel because they were incapacitated before that choice became necessary. And it explains why M-24 ended up so far from its intended destination. The crew was slowly dying as they navigated, making increasingly poor decisions until they made no decisions at all. But there's a third theory, one that delves into the psychology of the warrior code that shaped these men from childhood. Both M-27 and M-22 had ended with their crews choosing death over capture, following the principles of Bushido to their ultimate conclusion. Chuman and Omori had detonated their scuttling charges, destroying themselves and their submarine, rather than allowing the enemy to take either. Matsuo and Suzuku had taken their own lives with service pistols, rather than wait for depth charges to crush them or water to drown them. Could Ban and Ashibe have made a similar choice? but for different reasons. They had successfully escaped Sydney Harbour. They had survived where their comrades had died. But perhaps they recognized that their submarine was damaged, that their batteries wouldn't last, that reaching the rendezvous point was impossible. Perhaps they decided that attempting to rendezvous would only risk revealing the position of the mother submarines to pursuing Allied forces. If this was their reasoning, turning north made sense. They could lead any pursuit away from the real rendezvous point, sacrifice themselves to protect the larger submarines and their 100-man crews. This would have been considered a noble death, a final act of service that gave meaning to their sacrifice. Under this theory, Ban and Ashibe would have continued north until their batteries were completely exhausted, then made their final preparations. Perhaps they attempted to surface one last time, to see the sky before the end. Perhaps they sat in the darkness as the submarine slowly settled toward the bottom, contemplating their fate. Perhaps they took their own lives, following the example of their fellow submariners, choosing the moment and manner of their death rather than leaving it to chance. But here's where this theory encounters problems. There's no physical evidence of suicide. No bullet holes in the hull, no damage consistent with scuttling charges. When M-22 was raised, the evidence of what Matsuo and Suzuku had done was unmistakable.
M-24 shows no such evidence.
If Ban and Ashibe chose death, they did so in a way that left no trace. A fourth possibility combines elements of all the previous theories, while adding a new dimension: mechanical failure. The wreck shows that M-24's batteries suffered catastrophic corrosion damage. While much of this occurred after the submarine sank, maritime archaeologists have noted that the pattern of corrosion suggests the batteries may have been compromised during the mission itself. If a battery cell ruptured or a seal failed while M-24 was still operational, it would have created a cascade of problems. The submarine would have lost power gradually, with the motors becoming less responsive, the lights dimming, the control systems becoming sluggish. Ban would have had to make a terrible choice: continue trying to reach the rendezvous point with failing batteries and risk sinking before arrival, or surface and attempt to run on the surface where they could be seen and attacked, or find the nearest shallow water and attempt an emergency landing where they might have a chance of survival. If Ban chose the third option, it would explain why M-24 ended up off Bungenhead. He wasn't lost. He was looking for a place to set down the submarine where it wouldn't sink into the deep ocean, where there might be some possibility, however remote, of surviving until rescue, or at least of ensuring that their bodies wouldn't be lost to the depths. But if this was his plan, it failed. Either the submarine sank before reaching truly shallow water, or the crew was already incapacitated by the time it reached the bottom. Historians and naval analysts have also examined the tactical peculiarities of Ban's behavior during the attack itself. It took M-24 90 minutes to travel less than a mile from its initial sighting near Garden Island to its firing position off Bradley's Head. This seems inexplicably slow for a submarine that had covered much greater distances in less time earlier in the evening. Why did Ban take so long to get into position? Some analysts suggest that M-24 was already experiencing mechanical problems during the attack, that Ban was nursing a damaged or failing submarine through its final mission, buying time to line up his shot while knowing that every minute decreased his chances of escape. Others propose that Ban was deliberately drawing out the attack to keep Allied forces focused on the harbor, buying time for his fellow submarines, or simply accepting that death was inevitable and choosing to make it count for as much as possible. The truth is that we will probably never know with certainty what happened in those final hours. The physical evidence is limited and ambiguous. The crew left no written records, no final messages, no clues about their intentions or their fate. The submarine itself, while remarkably preserved in some ways, has been damaged by 6 decades of corrosion. marine growth, and fishing net entanglement. The wreck is a war grave, protected by law and by respect for the dead, which means that intrusive investigation is prohibited. What we do know is this: two young men, Ban age 23 and Ashibe age 24, set out on a mission from which they likely knew they would never return. They penetrated one of the most heavily defended harbors in the Pacific. They fired their weapons at a major warship. They escaped when their comrades had died, and then they vanished into the darkness, heading in the wrong direction, toward a fate that remains shrouded in mystery despite all our modern technology and forensic capabilities. In Japan, families waited for news that never came.
Kazutomo Ban,
the 74-year-old brother of Lieutenant Ban, spent decades wanting to know where his brother had died, wanting some small piece of the submarine to commemorate him. He remembered the day at the train station when he and his mother said goodbye to his brother, watching him leave for a war from which he would never return. When M-24 was finally discovered, Kazutomo Ban faced a difficult question. Should the submarine be raised and his brother's remains recovered? Or should it be left as a war grave? Undisturbed, after much reflection, he concluded that perhaps it was better to let his brother rest in peace. Itsuo Ashibe, the 84-year-old brother of Petty Officer Ashibe. He initially hoped the submarine would be recovered so he could have something of his brother's, even just a shoe or a personal item. He had lost 4 brothers in the war and wanted some closure for at least one of them. But he too came to accept that M-24 should remain where it is, a memorial beneath the waves. M-24 remains where it was found, 55 meters below the surface, 3 miles off Bungan Head. The submarine sits upright on the sandy bottom, its hull slowly being reclaimed by the ocean, its secrets sealed inside a steel tomb that has become both a war grave and a memorial. The 500-meter exclusion zone around the wreck is monitored by cameras and sonar equipment, ensuring that Ban and Ashibe rest undisturbed in their final resting place. On May 31st each year, ceremonies are held at HMAS Kudabul in Sydney to commemorate the attack. Representatives from the Australian and Japanese governments lay wreaths together, honoring all 27 men who died that night, the 21 Allied sailors aboard the Kudabul, and the 6 Japanese submariners who never came home. It's a ritual of remembrance that transcends the old divisions of war, acknowledging that on both sides were young men who believed they were serving their countries, who showed courage in the face of death, and who paid the ultimate price. The story of the Sydney Harbour attack has become an important part of Australian history, taught in schools and commemorated in museums. The composite submarine, built from the salvaged remains of M-27 and M-22, sits in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, where visitors can see the cramped interior where 4 men chose death over capture. The conning tower from M-22 is displayed at the Royal Australian Navy Heritage Centre on Garden Island, overlooking the very waters where the battle took place. But M-24 holds a unique place in this history because of its mystery. While the fates of the other submarines are known and documented, M-24's final hours remain open to interpretation. This ambiguity haunts us because it reminds us of a fundamental truth about war. Not all stories have clear endings. Not all questions have answers. And not all mysteries can be solved, even when we find what we're looking for. Consider what we know. Ban and Ashibe escaped Sydney Harbour successfully. They were the only submarine crew to fire their weapons and survive the immediate aftermath. They had a clear route back to the rendezvous point. Yet they ended up miles away in the wrong direction. Their submarine intact, but their bodies still sealed inside. The entry ladder in the raised position, suggesting they never attempted to escape. Did they become disoriented in the darkness, their compass damaged, or their judgment impaired by exhaustion and stress? Did toxic fumes from failing batteries slowly poison them as they navigated northward, believing they were heading south to safety? Did they make a conscious choice to lead pursuit away from the mother submarines, sacrificing themselves to protect the larger vessels and their crews? Or did mechanical failure force them to seek shallow water? A desperate gamble that failed in the final moments. The historical record shows us the broader context of their sacrifice. The USS Chicago, the primary target of the entire operation, was sunk less than 8 months later at the Battle of Rennell Island. HMAS Canberra, the other major target in the harbor that night, went down at the Battle of Savo Island just 2 months after the Sydney attack. None of the 5 Japanese mother submarines survived the war. I-22 was sunk in December 1942. I-24 went down in June 1943. I-27 was destroyed in February 1943. I-21 lasted until February 1944. And I-29 was torpedoed in July 1944. The attack on Sydney Harbour changed very little in the grand strategic scope of the Pacific War. It didn't divert significant American naval forces from the Central Pacific. It didn't demoralize the Australian civilian population. The 21 deaths aboard the Kootabool, while tragic, were a tiny fraction of the casualties that would be suffered on both sides over the next 3 years. In purely military terms, the attack was a failure that cost 6 trained submariners and 3 sophisticated vessels in exchange for sinking an unarmed accommodation ship. But the human cost cannot be measured in strategic terms. 21 families lost fathers, sons, brothers. 6 Japanese families received white boxes containing ashes and official condolences. Among the Allied dead were men like David Trist and Frank Kirby, who had already survived other sinkings, who had already faced death and escaped it once, only to find it waiting for them in a place they thought was safe. War doesn't just kill people, it kills futures, possibilities, all the things those people might have been and done if they had lived. Ban was 23. Ashibe was 24. What would their lives have been if they had survived? Would Ban have become a merchant ship captain, navigating peaceful waters in the years after the war? Would Ashibe have raised children, told them stories about his service? Grown old surrounded by grandchildren? We'll never know. Their futures died with them in that submarine. And all that remains is the mystery of how it happened. In 2007, Japanese and Australian naval officers held a joint ceremony aboard HMAS Newcastle to honor the crew of M-24. Family members of all the submariners attended, along with one of the survivors from the Kootabool. They sailed together to the site where M-24 rests and poured sake into the water, a traditional offering to the dead. Sand taken from the seafloor around the submarine was presented to the families as a tangible connection to the place where their loved ones remain. It was a moment of reconciliation, a recognition that the men who fought on both sides of that conflict were human beings who deserved to be remembered with dignity. The fact that we still don't fully understand what happened to Ban and Ashibe doesn't diminish their courage or their service. If anything, the mystery adds a layer of poignancy to their story, a reminder that war leaves gaps in the historical record that can never be filled, questions that can never be answered, and losses that can never be fully comprehended. So we're left with those haunting questions. Did Ban and Ashibe know they were going to die? Did they have time to make peace with their fate? Or did death come suddenly and unexpectedly? Did they think of their families in those final moments? Did they regret their mission? Or did they die believing they had served honorably? The submarine knows the answers, but it's not talking. It sits in the darkness, slowly rusting away, taking its secrets deeper into the sand with each passing year. The entry ladder remains raised. The crew remains inside. And the mystery of M-24 endures. Do you believe Ban and Ashibe were trying to survive, heading toward what they thought was safety only to be betrayed by failing batteries and toxic fumes? Or do you believe they made a conscious choice to disappear into the depths, following the warrior's code to its logical conclusion, becoming ghosts in the service of their mission? Perhaps the truth is that we're not meant to know. Perhaps some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some graves better left undisturbed. What matters is not the precise circumstances of how they died, but that we remember they lived, that they were real people caught up in forces far larger than themselves, and that their story, incomplete as it is, teaches us something important about the cost of war and the value of reconciliation. Beneath the waves off Sydney's northern coast, M-24 waits in the darkness, a silent memorial to two young men who vanished into history, leaving behind only questions, theories, and the eternal mystery of what happened in those final hours when the submarine turned north and sailed toward oblivion.